Hi, I'm Brian Zeger, and this is Living the Classical Life.
Brian, it's such a delight to welcome you onto the show. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure, thank you.
So many of our former guests here and many of our viewers have wondered when we would have you on, so we're excited to speak with you. So I was not the type of performer who felt a lot of innate confidence, especially from the beginning. What do you tell such young musicians who are aspiring to performing who have not much confidence?
That's a good question. Well, I think it's very much on a case-by-case basis, Jolt. I think it depends on where their insecurities come from. It's usually a lack of preparation, and sometimes it's because they've not yet defined who they are as artists and what their own artistic vision is. I mean, for instance, in my journey, I was concentrating on solo piano for many years, and I needed to do that in order to become a pianist. I had a lot of catch-up to do even later into my 20s as a pianist, of some kinds of work that some kids do very early on. But finally, that was not the place where I was most confident. In fact, I think had I gone at that for many more years and many more practice hours, that confidence wouldn't have come, because that's not where I was really meant to be. I think for each person, they've got to find the artistic niche that speaks to who they are, and that gives them a kind of work which they simply want to wake up and do all day.
At what point did you find that collaborative work resonated very much with you?
You know, it was a kind of a very strange accident. Well, I would say there were two accidents. One of which was that when I was an undergraduate English major at Harvard, I happened to come into the orbit of a really fascinating genius, I would say, a composer called Earl Kim, who was a remarkable composer, but he was even more remarkable at the way that he could instill a kind of musicianship in young people, and again, a kind of curiosity for going really, really deep into the music that we studied. So I was lucky that I was 18, 19 when that happened. So here I was, in a liberal arts school, English major actually, but passionate about the piano. I've been playing the piano since I was 5 years old. But through this work with Earl, he really introduced me to Schubert songs, Debussy songs, Mozart opera. These were revelations to me. And then the second coincidence, which was even much more random, was when I landed at Juilliard at age 21 as a master's student in solo piano. I knew that I needed to make a living. I mean, I was basically on my own dime at that point. And there were only two names in the music faculty that I knew. One was Dorothy DeLay, the famous violin teacher, and the other one was Eleanor Stieber, who I knew had been a famous singer. I knocked on Miss Stieber's door. She said, "Come in," and I just started playing for her. And within that year, I was already playing concerts with her, actually. And I didn't know that I had a particular gift for this, but I loved vocal music. I was a very confident sight reader, I'll say that. I was eager to learn, and here I was learning from someone who had learned at the feet of Fritz Reiner and Bruno Walter, and I mean, had this amazing career. I caught her at the end of her life, really, but that was an extraordinary introduction for me.
So, collaborative pianists often have to do so much work that in some cases, it's almost no rehearsal time. How do you, as an artist, try to adapt or put yourself in the position to adapt almost on the spot to tuning into whoever your artist is?
Well, you do. I mean, hopefully that begins with a really broad basis in repertoire, so that in fact, once you've done it for a number of years, Jolt, you're seldom seeing music that's completely unfamiliar to you. But you have to, again, I mean, Neuhaus's comment about confidence was well taken. You have to have the sort of mental equilibrium to just be able to read and listen and go with the flow and support what else is going on in the room. I think what it really finally comes down to for everyone who collaborates, and that can also mean the violist in a string quartet or a player in an orchestra or a member of an opera ensemble, it has to do with tuning into where the other musicians in the room are at and how you can best support and collaborate with them.
This question of support and tuning into whatever's going on in the room, would you say that there's actually a psychological component to being a successful collaborator? And do you think that that quality is part of your personality?
It is part of my personality, and it's part of the personality of many people who succeed in doing what I do. But I also think it can't exactly be taught, but it can be awakened. And you can certainly awaken young people for when they're not being collaborative and thinking more selfishly and not noticing what's going on around them. And that's a matter of maturity. I mean, I think many young people certainly go through a long adolescent phase when it's all pretty much about themselves. I think that's a healthy part of psychological development, but there has to be a point, if you're going to be in my world, where it's not primarily about you, but you're there to make music with others.
For you, in finding your own sound and your own voice, was this a conscious, deliberate effort, or was this something that just evolved on its own based on other factors?
You know, the way I like to think about it, Jolt, is that I hope in my playing, when it's working at its best, that I have many voices. I want to be more about the voice of the composer. I would like my approach to music to be as multiform as it could possibly be, and also my approach to collaboration. So, I've had the great luck of playing with some of the biggest voices, these big dramatic singers, and I've also played with flutists and violists, where you basically never play above a mezzo forte. You have to find what works for the situation you're in. I think the great challenge and the great opportunity for any collaborator in that way is to be as versatile, as adaptable. That's the nature of our support. It's got to work with what's around it. There's a marvelous story that my teacher Nina Svetlanova told me of going to a concert that Richter gave with his wife Nina Dorliak, right? Who had a very light voice. I mean, she was unusually for a Russian singer. She had one of the smaller voices. And Nina said she went to this entire recital, had a completely satisfying experience, and then later realized that Richter had never played above pianissimo. But he had a range of sound within that pianissimo. He created an entire world. So I think that's the gift. That's also the gift, I think, of a great accompanist conductor who can play a concerto with a firebrand 25-year-old pianist, and then maybe a brilliant Clifford Curzon elder statesman at the end of his life who plays more softly, but it has another kind of complete performance. That adaptability is what makes our life so interesting.
So I'm interested in the idea of 1 + 1 = 3 in these collaborations. I would say that looking at the extremely impressive roster of musicians you've worked with, did you ever have an experience in which the artistry of this particular artist made you rethink what it meant to make a musical phrase?
I have, and honestly, actually, some of the artists I've collaborated with who were not musicians were some of the biggest revelations to me. I had about 10 years in my life where I worked quite closely with two Martha Graham dancers, Therese Capocilli and Christine Dakin, who were the great sort of inheritors of Graham's mantle. This was after Martha Graham had died, but we did a bunch of work together, and I have to say, watching those women in the way that they use space, in the way they use their bodies, their kind of physical phrasing, was a huge inspiration to me. I can't say in words necessarily how, but watching them and working closely and over a period of time with them. In fact, I did some concerts with Christine last year. She's an older dancer now, but she does that marvelous Graham Lamentations piece where she sits on the bench, swaddled in that extraordinary piece of fabric, and seeing the devotion to her work, the kind of inner intensity that's there, was a huge inspiration to me.
So you're involved in music in many different capacities. As a pianist, you're involved, in fact, you're the director of the vocal arts program here at Juilliard.
Right.
And you've also done some writing.
Yeah.
How important is it to you to keep a very diverse set of musical involvements?
It is really important to me. And growing up, the two really, I would say, equally important things in my life that were extremely important to me as a kid and as a young adult were both music and literature. And the fact that in my professional life I've been able to put them together through my interest in vocal music, which of course is involving the greatest poetry, and opera, which is involving drama, just makes it extremely fertile for me. And I find in my lessons, particularly with my more advanced students, we're talking about literature all the time. We're always talking about poetry. We're talking about the worlds that these musical compositions came out of. Writers are equally important.
So, in fact, if we look at the curriculum of an ideal music education, what would you say is an important part of musical, academic, or even human development that perhaps a lot of young people are overlooking?
Well, I think to be as satisfied as you could be with the music we play, you have to understand the worlds that music came out of. So you have to have a way into whatever period you're talking about, whether it's 19th century Germany or France, or if you go further back into the Baroque period, you have to understand the world the political world that those folks lived in. And the best way is through literature. History is also useful, but I have to say a lot of musicians, a deep historical knowledge is probably a bit of a stretch. But literature can get you there very quickly. Film can get you there. I mean, there are many, many ways in, but you've got to understand those worlds.
Would you say that young musicians these days are pressured to focus too much on image rather than substance?
You know, I'm proud to say that I think here at Juilliard we do quite a good job with trying to constantly develop the inner content of the artist. And I think if you could just remind the young person that finally what they present to the world that's going to communicate with audiences is what's inside them, and that they have to be able to look inside, come up with an authentic expression that really, really comes out of them and connects in a very honest way with the music. That's where you have to study. The rest is all wrapping paper. Wrapping paper is important. They're going to have eventually publicists and press people who are going to help define who they are, but their job is to define who they are from the inside.
Having done enormous amounts of every kind of repertoire, what kind of music are you most drawn to?
Gee. You know, there are many pockets of repertoire that I feel are real strengths for me and music which I simply couldn't live without. But I think the common denominator among them is a kind of intimacy of expression. And I think that's, at the end of the day, that's why the song recital is such an important vehicle of expression for me. Most of the song literature that we all love was written for performance within an intimate space. It's not really for a large public, or certainly not for a large public all at the same time. None of that was designed to be sung for 4,000 people on the stage of the Metropolitan Opera, although I've seen artists succeed in that venue amazingly. I think that intimacy of expression, the intimacy which also comes out of the scale of the poetry that's being sung, that's what resonates with me most deeply.
How can we reconcile this pursuit, subtlety, and projection within an intimate setting, within the world in which we live, where these are not necessarily, at least publicly, valued?
Yeah. Well, you know, I think that my generation, I have to say, is not doing a great job at leading the way, because I came at the end of a wave, having started performing really in the 70s, but primarily in the 80s, when there was a lot more recital activity going on. It was easier to get those kinds of recitals, and even singers who were not big opera stars were able to get recitals. Now it's very difficult, but I think the generation that's going to solve this jolt, this is my prayer anyway, my hope, is the next generation, the people I'm now teaching, and the ones coming after them. I think it may be a digital means of communication. I think the fact that any young person who can type can find remarkable performances by a Jerry Finley, by a Renee Fleming, by a Cecilia Bartoli on YouTube like that, on Spotify, et cetera, is an incredible boon for them. Now, there's not yet a business model for that becoming a profitable way of those artists getting their work out. But I think that will have to come. But the old style big diva concert, I think will go sort of the way of the dinosaur, perhaps.
Let's talk about your daily work, because I'm curious to know how people who are successful in many capacities and do so much, how do they structure a daily regimen that also allows for just time to breathe and think and to ponder and let an artistic interpretation blossom, really?
Well, look, in terms of my artistic day-to-day, there have been times it's been very challenging, but there was a period when I was working both full-time at Juilliard and at the Metropolitan Opera, and running a summer program at Ravinia while performing. It was a lot. I would say the biggest challenge for me, very honestly, is finding practice time. And particularly finding practice time which is not dedicated to a specific concert that's coming up, but just general taking care of my own playing time. That's really challenging. But my life has simplified somewhat in the last year or so. I'm no longer working at the Met Opera. I just found balancing 2 jobs at the same time was too much. So I'm just at Juilliard now. But I have to say, every day I walk into this building, the energy that I get from the young people is a challenge to me to have that energy myself. It's incredibly inspiring.
Have you always been an optimist?
I wouldn't characterize myself that way. I think I live on different planes at the same time. I think in many ways, in terms of the way the world is going, in the larger world, I'm not particularly an optimist. But if I am an optimist, what makes me so are the young people that I'm around, because we're so gifted and blessed here to be able to attract extraordinary students from all over the world. And when I hear the stories and live through the stories of some people that have had incredibly difficult life journeys, but music and art for them has been their lifeline the way it was for me growing up, that makes me optimistic.
With the inevitable ups and downs of any artistic journey and any path to success, how did you deal with the moments that were either discouraging or disappointing? Perhaps another area is dealing with less than favorable reviews, for example. Sure.
Well, my period of real struggle was my 20s. I got here to Juilliard when I was just to turn 21. And while I was a student, it was exciting. I was growing, I was learning. But all through my later 20s, I was really struggling financially. I was very much on my own. I was making a living playing for singers already by then, but doing a level of work, playing auditions, playing voice lessons, kind of very low level of coachings for a huge variety of people that I knew would not satisfy me. And I knew that I had to graduate myself from that level. So that was a period of real struggle that took a lot of patience. And I would say what got me through was my connection with the music. I mean, I knew that I loved this stuff and understood it in a way that could be valuable to the field. And it just took a while, for instance, for me to get my first job here at Juilliard teaching. That was in my 30s, my early 30s. By then, things started to come together. I also, through the good ministrations of Sam Sanders, a great collaborative pianist who was a great mentor and friend of mine, he more or less handed me the directorship of a chamber music festival. And running that small festival in the summer was an incredible kind of hands-on learning experience for me. I learned about development, I learned about audience development, about programming, dealing with artists, dealing with managers, venues, all of that. That was a terrific kind of let's put on a show sort of experience. And having succeeded with that, I'm very proud of my 8 years with the festival, which we grew exponentially. And the festival is still flourishing now, and I think in its 36th or 7th year now, and I still play there. That was if anything fueled my optimism, that was it. I saw that through hard work and real artistic vision, you could change a whole community.
Some years ago, I was speaking with a dear old friend of mine, pianist, wonderful pianist who had a blossoming career, Paul Shenley, who runs Piano Fest out in the Hamptons. He told me at some point, he said, Joel, no matter how famous or not famous you become, you'll find that most of your most rewarding musical experiences will come by way of your friends. Has that been true in your case? And what has been the role of friendship in the growth of your musical life? Well,
it has been. I've been lucky to have some really long collaborative associations with folks like Deborah Voigt, with Marilyn Horne. These are people who are still very much in my life. I perform with Debbie some now, not as much as I did. Marilyn is now retired. Those have been rewarding. And there are people that I went to school with too, singers like Suzanne Menser, Hae Kyung Hong, and some people who are not household names but are having good lives in music. Those long friendships are really rewarding. And I'm proud to say that I've now taught for long enough that some of people who studied with me or were students here when I was a teacher are now 40 years old and well into their careers and having really nourishing lives in music. That's extremely rewarding to me. And we're all buddies now. There's a point, it's a marvelous moment when they graduate from being a student to being a colleague. I love that transition, and I love helping them make that transition because it's for the teacher to help them recognize that they in fact have now reached a peer status.
We get a lot of letters on this show from young conservatory students from around the world who tell us usually one of two things. One, thank you for showing me that there is a pathway for me in this musical world. And two, thank you for showing me that I'm not alone in my struggles. When I think about you and your musical life, it seems that you had the confidence early on and you've had success all along the way. Were there any moments along the way in which you doubted yourself or your ability to have a musical life?
Oh, absolutely. I would say while I was pursuing solo piano, I had some luck in competitions, a lot of non-luck in competitions, a lot of failure. My 20s were hard, and I saw people passing me by. I felt I was in a slowly moving car, and there were sports cars zooming by me. People who were equipped in different ways than I was. That was hard, but it took somehow, and I wish I could figure out what clicked in me, but something in my late 20s, I sort of woke up and realized I am a collaborative pianist. That I'm already doing that. I mean, I was playing concerts, I was getting recognized for that work. I sort of thought it was a side thing. I never realized that was really what I was put on this planet to do. And then later on, it was actually really through the vision of Joseph Polizzi, Juilliard's longtime president. He saw a gift in administration in me, which I didn't see at all. He spent about 1.5 years trying to talk me into doing the current job that I'm enjoying so much at Juilliard, running the vocal arts program, because he saw a flair for administration in me, which I didn't honestly know I had. He talked me into it. I was extremely concerned at the time, and I don't think this was a foolish concern, but I couldn't see how I would be able to balance the rigors of the administrative job with my playing.
Is it possible?
Well, I did it. Yes, it is possible. And look, the reality, Jolt, is I'm not playing 100 concerts a year. I never was. I was probably at my height playing maybe 40 or 50. It's now significantly less than that. And the balance has been okay for me. For me, I can only speak to my own journey. There came a point at which heading out to LaGuardia and getting on another plane was not such a thrilling prospect. Living out of a suitcase was not so wonderful. But I have to say that also coincided with a real reduction in the availability of vocal recitals particularly.
If competitions are the imposition of external judgment, how do you construct for yourself a sense of artistic identity that's free of that judgment and hopefully free of your own destructive judgment, which has often been a struggle for me?
Yeah. Well, looking back at it, with the wisdom of 30 years of hindsight now, I realized that part of it was I was entering the wrong ones and I was programming the wrong music. I mean, I had a marvelous Russian teacher, Nina Svelanova.
Yes.
I mentioned her name. She helped me in every way with my playing. But the lens through which she saw music was that great Russian tradition, which involved Rachmaninoff and Liszt and Chopin. These are composers I love. Some people play them better than I do. I have to say, I think my list of composers really was Schubert, Debussy, Mozart, some Beethoven. There's music I can play very well, and I should have stuck with it. And when I look at careers like Angela Hewitt's, for instance, or Paul Lewis's, these are people who stuck with what they did best. Andras Schiff also, in fact. I mean, these are enormously equipped pianists who I admire hugely, but they became somewhat specialists. And if I had had the vision and the self-knowledge to stay more specialized and not try to diversify, I was never going to play a Liszt Transcendental Etude better than anyone else in the room. That was not going to happen no matter how many hours I spent.
Do you encourage your students to have to diversify, or do you encourage them to find a voice within a repertoire that resonates with them?
I think they have, well, working with singers for decades now has been a real education to me in realizing that each person has a voice. They have to find out what that voice is. They have to find out what they identify with and what they can execute better than anyone else. I mean, for me, again, it was this more intimate style of playing, which I'm really comfortable in. Barnstorming pianists can play different repertoire. The same way that nobody doubts that there are Baroque voices and there are Wagner voices. That's usually not the same person. Although it's funny, I was just so delighted to see in Sonia Yoncheva's biography, I heard her Tosca was marvelous the other night, that 10 years ago she was in the Jardin des Voix of William Christie. I mean, I don't quite know how that happened. I don't know her personally, but sometimes journeys can be surprising. So I think it's a matter of checking in with yourself constantly to see how you're growing. And that's one of the, again, thrilling things about working with young people. They change really fast. And you have to have a real-time check-in with them to see how they're growing. One of the things that makes me most furious in the profession. I hear it around the school some, and I certainly hear it out in the business and management world when they say, this person will never sing this, or that's proven wrong all the time. I mean, the number of wonderful artists that I've been around who were told that they would never sing on the opera stage by major people, and I can tell you these are some of the biggest stars I know. Some of the authorities are just completely wrong. So you have to have that inner confidence, and you have to have a team that is listening to you with compassion, with insight, and with imagination.
Did you ever have someone tell you that you couldn't do something?
Yes, I mean, I think there were people, and I think they were trying to be helpful, and I think they were honest. Well, in fact, they came to this insight that I mentioned about myself way before I did, which is that I was not going to play the best Rachmaninoff concerto around. That's not what my chops were able to offer me.
Was that difficult for you to accept, or was there a transition that involved?
You know, I didn't really grapple with it, Jolt. I can't say that I accepted it or didn't accept it. I think I was insufficiently self-analytic at that time to really sit down with myself and understand what that meant. I was, you know, in the way that young people do, I was still just kind of groping, I would say. And one thing I'll say, though, and this was true of Nina's teaching and of my learning as a pianist, is that she was right that I needed to learn some of the skills I would learn working on that music, whether I ended up being a successful performer of it or not, in the same way that a singer may have to learn Puccini roles in order to be able to sing Mozart roles well. That can be true, even though the person won't get paid to sing Puccini.
What was it like to work with Nina Svetlanova? I grew up with my first piano teacher, Roger Shields. He was rather good friends with her.
Oh, yeah?
And I would often hear her name. For those who haven't met her or seen her in action, what was she like as a teacher and as a person?
For me, she was a remarkable teacher. I mean, I had big gaps technically in my arsenal that I'd grown up with, and she was very adroit at addressing those while always honoring what it was that I was good at. She was very good at understanding your strengths and buttressing your weaknesses at the same time. I think she, speaking of insight, she just got me as a musician. I felt that right from the first moment. But she realized where the gaps were. We addressed them very honestly. We worked several times a week for quite a few years. She was very generous with me. As I said, I was basically supporting myself, so I didn't have money for lots of expensive lessons. She was very kind to me in that way. But she believed in me as a pianist. We're still good friends. And the lessons were extremely insightful, kind of microscopes into playing. She was a real technician in that way. But her goal as a teacher, which has become my goal as a teacher, is to give her students tools that they can then use. You have to be able to own those tools as a student. The tools should not remain within the hands of the teacher.
I think that when we look at our lives on the stages, we can think of one or two maybe particularly special memories of a sense of magic happening on stage. Can you think of an instance in which you particularly felt in the zone?
Yeah, you know, I had a recital with Bryn Tervel at Ravinia probably 6 or 7 years ago now, something like that. And just being with Bryn, I mean, and rehearsing with him, the liveliness of the storytelling, the connection that he makes with the audience, not to mention this extraordinary voice of his. And it's a very congenial hall for vocal recitals there at Ravinia. It seats, I don't know, 800 people, something like that. It's a lovely size where everybody feels really connected with the performers. That was a huge high point for me. And I'll say another high point had to do more with kind of extra musical elements. When Debbie Voigt was in the middle of the great black dress controversy and you know, the question of singers' weight and appearance was so much in the press. She was doing tons of TV about it and everything. She happened to have a Carnegie recital with me around the same time, and my partner Ben Moore had written a very charming and funny song called Wagner Rolls about why do I have to sing Wagner? I'd like to sing something light. And he put in a line about the black dress. We did it as an encore, and I have to say, the laugh that she got and the cheers that she got completely stopped that song. And I realized that was not so much a matter of being in a musical moment. We were kind of like in a historical moment at that moment, in which a sold-out Carnegie Hall all got to rally for their beloved singer in this dilemma that she had with her weight, with the industry and the way it was developing, and the fact that Ben could fine-tune that song to speak to that audience in that moment was just an incredibly fun thing to be a part of.
Okay, well, back to the conservatory students who are watching this. They were probably hearing all these stories of success, and they said, oh, that's all wonderful and said and done. But here I am in school, and I'm wondering what happens next. How on earth can I make a living? I'm living here in New York City, rents are sky high. How do I make it financially work? Are there ways to do this?
Sure. I mean, they need to make sure that in their pool of people that are helping them, there are people that are in the real world. I think some of the biggest challenge for conservatory students is that they've been trained by fine teachers and fine, very well-meaning administrators, but who are largely in the world of academia. One of the gifts that we have at Juilliard is that I include myself, but most of my colleagues are also in the real professional world. And so that we have a kind of real world sense of what the professional avenues are. But I think any gifted young person can find mentors within the real professional world. So if you're in another part of the country, maybe it's the instrumentalist in the local orchestra. Maybe it's a local singer who's made it. You've got to find people who have figured out how to make this work. And look, a musical life can also certainly involve teaching, can involve presenting, can involve all kinds of musical activities. It doesn't all have to, it's not all about the money you just earn on the stage. In fact, that's a tiny percentage, if you think about it, Jolt, of all the musicians in the world. How many make their living solely from what they do on the stage? Is it 1%? Is it 5%? It's a small percentage.
Okay, so Brian, that's one aspect of it. So that's being able to make a living and feeling comfortable in that role. What about all the performers who have that in place and they feel great difficulty in finding the zone in performance? How do you find your zone consistently?
Because I'm a collaborator and I'm virtually never on stage by myself now, I find it from the other people. You know, it's that old corny thing that you've heard every actor say on the Actor Studio program, which is that acting is reacting. If you're really paying attention to the colleague that you're out there making music with and helping them in real time, listening to where they are, how's their energy, how's their mood, how's the color of their music making that day, then it's alive. Look, how does an actor do a show on Broadway 8 times a week for years? How do they keep those moments fresh? They all say, and it's simply true of good actors and good performers, that they have to be living the piece in real time. And you know, I'm playing pieces now. I warm up every day with Bach that I started playing when I was 8 and 10 years old, so it's been 40, 50 years of these same Bach pieces. They're not stale for me. I mean, if you really notice how those voices are speaking to one another within your fingers, and those voices are having a real time conversation, it can't be dull. I mean, that's what gets me into the zone, if that answers your question.
You've already done so much. Is there anything you still aspire to do in your musical life or otherwise?
You know what I really want to get back to, which was a big part of my life in my 20s and 30s, is much more chamber music. I love that literature. There are some deeply beloved pieces. I would name the Brahms Clarinet Trio, Beethoven Archduke Trio, Mozart Kegelstadt, the clarinet viola piano piece, which I have a very specific connection to that piece. I mean, there's a lot of chamber music that I want to have in my life while I'm still playing well. I love that kind of collaboration, and I'm actually working quite hard with digging up old colleagues and saying, hey, I'm still here. This is something that's really important to me.
Brian, thank you so much for being on the show.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you for sharing your life experiences, and we wish you much success in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank
It's
you
my
so
pleasure,
much.
Joel.
Yes,
Awesome. It was fun. Yes.